Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Dynamo Virtual Hub Series event entitled Decarbonization of Buildings, the Role of Real Estate in the Energy Transition. I'm Sam Denham, Events and Communications Manager here at Dynamo Energy Hub. And for those of you joining us for the first time, we would like to say welcome and share just a few words about Dynamo. Dynamo Energy Hub brings together traditional energy companies and clean tech innovators, investors, and entrepreneurs to shape the future of energy. Dynamo is a unique collection of global networking spaces. Our hubs are located in state-of-the-art offices, which include flexible workspace, networking events, and thought leadership webinars, like the one we're hosting today. We'll start off today's event with a few words from Stephanie Green, Senior Principal and Lead of the Carbon-Free Buildings Program at Rocky Mountain Institute. We'll then transition into a conversation between Stephanie and Sarah Neff, newly appointed head of ESG at Lend-Lease Americas and member of the Dynamo Board of Advisors. We'll leave the last 10 minutes of the event for Q&A. So please, if you have any questions, enter them through the chat box. With that, I'm delighted to turn it over to Stephanie to get us started with a few words about RMI. Stephanie, thank you so much for being here with us today. We have a lot to cover, so let's get started.
Great, thank you so much, Sam, and thanks to all of you for your time and for attending our session today. So Sam, will you be able to share the slides?
Yes.
Great, yeah, so I'm just gonna start off the conversation today with a few slides to set the stage for why buildings are so critical in our energy transition, and then and therefore why industry and policymakers. So actually, Sam, just go to the first title slide if you don't mind. So, and why industry and policymakers must play a leadership role in changing how we build and how we operate our buildings. You get to see the preview of my presentation in reverse, which is excellent. So yeah, so if you could just go to the next slide, Sam. Slide. I don't see it yet, but great, thanks. Okay, so I'll start by saying that no climate goals can be met without substantial participation from the building sector. So their electricity usage, the on-site emissions of natural gas, oil, and propane, and the embodied carbon in their construction, including every climate goal has to include buildings and these emissions. Next slide, please. So in case you're wondering, what will it take to meet our climate goals? It's actually a pretty ambitious level of speed that we need to decarbonize the building sector. So we need to hit 100% zero emissions by 2050. I'm sure many of you know that. The thing that always gives me the urgency to show up to work every day is that we also have to reach a 50% emissions reduction in less than 10 years. Next slide, please. And the thing that I actually love about working on buildings is that making better buildings actually improves people's lives. So we actually spend 90% of our time inside buildings. I think it's probably gone up since the pandemic, unfortunately. But that means for both better and worse, that improving the comfort, the health, and the productivity of our building occupants can positively impact the lives of billions of people around the world. There's also a massive equity component to our buildings. So for example, only 5% of the programs from utility companies that make our homes more efficient benefit low-income populations. But meanwhile, air quality, thermal comfort, and high energy costs, they all disproportionately impact communities of color and disadvantaged communities. So if you're living in a zip code that's predominantly Black or brown, you're spending over 3 times your income on your energy costs than if you're living in a zip code that's predominantly white. And so buildings are also one of the largest contributors to air pollution, both indoors and outdoors. So what RMI research has found is that, for example, gas stoves, a study by MIT that we looked at shows that gas stoves burned indoors release NO2 emissions, nitrogen dioxide, at levels so high that they would be illegal outdoors. But indoor air quality is not regulated the way that outdoor air quality is. So we need to make healthier buildings, more comfortable buildings, and climate-aligned buildings. And we need to make this transition to be done correctly and equitably for billions of people around the world. Next slide, please. We also have a large productivity challenge in the real estate industry and the building construction sector. You can see this is labor productivity. This is a report by McKinsey. The orange line at the bottom of that graph is labor productivity in the construction sector. And you can see that unlike most others, basically every other sector in the economy, labor productivity is improved in most other sectors, and it has not done so in the building sector. And this basically means that construction has remained expensive while other sectors have been able to lower at least the labor component of their costs. And so when we talk about transitioning buildings to meet the energy challenge, we have labor supply challenges, we have a productivity challenge that increases costs as we change policy. It's harder to pay workers more, it's harder to build affordable housing, et cetera. Next slide, please. And then we are moving from a climate perspective, we are moving in the wrong direction. So as I mentioned from that beginning slide, we need to get rid of both direct and indirect emissions from buildings. And so yet every minute we're connecting new buildings to the gas system. World. And so we got to get that construction right from the start. And then 70% of the buildings today that are still standing will still be standing in 2050, which, to remind you, need to all be zero carbon at that time. So we have to address new construction, and we have to find ways to do zero carbon retrofits faster and affordably. Okay, so that was a lot of bad news, but that's the challenge we're facing today. If we can go to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about how can we get there. So that might have been a little bit of a Debbie Downer beginning, but the thing that I'm excited about is that we actually know how to make buildings zero carbon. We have the technology to do this today, and we just have to make it easier and more affordable and scalable. So there's 4 key levers that we think about at RMI when we think about zero carbon buildings. The first is electrification. So as our electricity sector has gotten greener, and it does not need to be 100% clean. This is something that I get asked a lot. As the electricity sector has gotten cleaner, even a partially renewable electricity system that is, if you have an electric better from a GHG emission furnace or a gas water heater. So we need lots of heat pumps. We need electric coil or induction stoves. We also need decarbonized electricity, and more active, and they can help balance renewables on the grid. They can help make building occupants use energy at the more cost-effective times of day. We still need energy efficiency. Megawatts will always be cost-effective, and we need to build efficiency into our planning so that clean buildings will be more affordable. And then we also need to get rid of embodied carbon in our construction materials, so primarily steel and concrete. And the good news is we have an increasing awareness of this issue with Buy Clean standards and green versions of these materials. Next slide, please. So I won't linger on this, but just to say that we at RMI believe that a mix of both policy change and market implementation and catalyzing the retrofit market and transforming the construction industry market, these are the types of approaches that are going to be required to meet our energy transition. And then final slide. And then just to recap kind of some of the high-level goals that we think are needed once we leverage policy, we leverage transformation in the market. We need to construct all new buildings to a zero carbon standard, all electric, efficient, grid interactive, and low or no embodied carbon. We need to retrofit 5% of buildings every year. So in the US, that's 4 million a year. We're averaging about 1 million a year today. So we need to 4 times that retrofit rate. We need to deploy a lot more capital towards those retrofits. And then we need to ensure that all new appliances, so at end of life, when people are making decisions about appliance and equipment replacement, those appliances should be electric, efficient, and grid interactive. So thank you. That's all I had to say to tee up the conversation. So now, Sarah, I'm really looking forward to talking with you today.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here. It's my first day in the office at Lend-Lease. This is not a Zoom background. This is just what this conference room looks like. It's very, very exciting.
That's amazing. Well, congratulations on your new role. Can you tell us a little bit about?
So you're a little bit on delay, so I'm going to assume you're asking me about my new role, which is I'm going to be I am head of ESG for Lend-Lease Americas. So Lend-Lease is a developer, a construction company, and has an investment management business. And so I'll be helping drive our sustainability goals through all of those businesses. Lend-Lease has a goal of being 100% zero carbon emissions by 2040 without the use of offsets. In addition to having some pretty ambitious goals around the creation of social value.
Oh, that's great. And I'm sorry I'm on delay. I'm going to try to dial in. Maybe that will help. The challenges of Zoom life. So Sarah, can you, I'm curious, tell us, what do you think about some of the challenges? Like, what do you see as some of the biggest opportunities of addressing the climate challenge in the building space?
Yeah, you addressed it a lot in your slides. And to me, the major challenge is, what has happened in the building sector is that the top 10%, let's say, of the market has in fact transformed, has driven down emissions, is being built to these very, very high levels of energy efficiency. And now we're seeing more and more companies, make commitments or achieve commitments towards scope 1 and scope 2 carbon neutrality. What's happening is that the rest of the market isn't able to really get there. The class B and C, the more market rate, the more affordable housing isn't able to take advantage. We have this group of leaders, and then the laggards are not coming by. A lot of it is, like you said, 5% of utility programs don't touch that market. That seems exactly what I would expect, actually. Utilities aren't particularly good at reaching those customers. It's hard to retrofit them. They're small. Vendors who do retrofits, they don't want to touch them because it's so many. They prefer to retrofit a really large building. The other thing is that our industry is waking up in the last 3 years, I would say, to the concept that embodied carbon is actually our largest source of emissions, and certainly is for a company like Lend-Lease that does so much construction and so much development. And so we're just at the very, very, maybe the first inning. We might still be in batting practice for figuring out how to address that meaningfully. There's a lot of great people working on it, but that is so new. The idea that when we procure our concrete, when we procure our steel, when we procure our carpet, we need to be taking carbon into consideration is incredibly new. And so that's something we're working on. And electrification is not easy, depending on what you're doing and depending on your climate. One of the things we're seeing is that, in temperate climates, like where my previous company, Kilroy Realty, operated, it was pretty easy. And we had all electric buildings in all of our markets, and that was great. About 20% of that portfolio is all electric. When you get into more extreme climates, not to say that it's not possible. I don't want anybody from the world of heat pumps to say it's not possible, but it's certainly more difficult when you're dealing especially with these extreme cold. So those are a lot of the challenges we're seeing.
Great, thank you, Sarah. And my apologies, there's a little bit of a crackling. I think it's my audio, but if others can hear it, we'll talk to Sam about fixing the audio crackling. So yeah, so that's really helpful. I am curious, like what do you feel like we need to do to address some of the underserved segments of the buildings community?
Absolutely. So there's a lot of different things. Those folks that there's great opportunity there because those buildings tend to be simpler, right? The retrofits that you need to do to get those buildings to be more efficient are less difficult to do. You can essentially, in some cases, do like a little bit retrofit in a box. And so we need companies where their bread and butter is being able to reach those customers. We know that they're, for example, effectively targeted through direct mail. It's not like these folks don't know about energy efficiency. It's just more difficult for them to access. We need point of sale rebates. So it's really easy to swap out when your stove goes kaput to get an induction stove, when your dishwasher goes kaput to get an Energy Star dishwasher, when your boiler goes to get a heat pump. So we need to see those, in places where people are buying their stuff. We also, all electric building codes would be very helpful. So we just make sure that everything, when it goes up, and I know that's something that that's being worked on the federal level. And then we also need utility participation. Obviously, this is quite difficult for a lot of utilities. Those who sell natural gas, some are on board. I'll call out Pacific Gas and Electric, which has actually been a partner of the Building Decarbonization Coalition. And then, there's been a lot of success in places in our country. Kentucky, for example, that has on-bill financing programs focused on electrification. So all of those things would really help marginalized communities and help us get access to access to more energy efficiency and decarbonization.
Great. I'm sorry to pause us, Sarah, but I think there's a crackling or something on your side. I keep thinking it's my side, but it seems to be on others' sides. Is there anything you can shift on your audio, Sarah? If not, we'll just plow ahead. I'll stay on mute while you talk.
Yeah, no, I don't hear anything on my side, but it could be,
yeah,
I'm not sure.
Okay, I'll let Sam or
while you're talking.
Try to. Yeah, let me see. Okay, I think it might be on your end, but it's fine. I don't know what else we can do at this point. I think we'll roll with it. And fixed. Yeah, Nate. Okay, Nate Richards is diagnosing us over here. He says it's fixed, but I think Sarah's on mute. So I think we might have diagnosed that it might be a Sarah audio challenge. But Sarah, I don't know what else to tell you to do. So I think we can just kind of roll with it and go with it. So so Sarah, can you help me understand? Thank you, Nate. Okay, we got some, yeah. Well, welcome to Zoom. I think it wouldn't be a good Zoom meeting if we didn't have, an audio snafu or a video snafu. So, Sarah, help me understand, in your previous role, you were working at Kilroy, right? What were some of the big, help me understand, what were some of the big challenges that you addressed, right? How did you get over some of the hurdles that we've talked about today to get Kilroy to such a leading place?
Great, and so we'll just switch which one of us is on mute now. I think maybe we'll see if that works. Okay, so so at Kilroy, we set the goal in 2018 at the Global Climate Action Summit of getting to carbon neutral operations. So that's scope 1 and scope 2 carbon neutrality, or in other words, all the natural gas and all the electricity that the company directly controlled, and trying to get that all zeroed out at the end of 2020. And that's a goal that the company achieved. I'm happy to say that. The problem is you can't do it all on site currently. And so the question is, how do you do it meaningfully offsite? So what Kilroy did was actually through Hawthorne Club, another fantastic Mead Harris organization. We entered into a power purchase agreement for offsite solar. So it's a large solar facility being built in Texas. And that is enough to sort of address all of the electricity that's happening on site. And then we had to go procure credits to deal with our natural gas. And so I think there's this view that somehow it's possible for every single building to get to net zero on site. It's not. That's, the building that I'm in right now in downtown Los Angeles, is quite a tall tower with a very small roof. There's not enough place for solar. It doesn't have a geothermal opportunity. Geothermal is hard in LA because of earthquakes. And then there's urban wind is difficult. So then we have to start thinking at scale. We start needing to think, outside the box. We need to start thinking about adding more renewables to the grid while we get rid of the natural gas. And so as the grid gets greener and greener, and we're getting rid of the natural gas that can't get there, you're not going to get to 100% renewable natural gas. I mean, even our gas company projects it's going to get to about 25% is its goal, which I think is actually somewhat aggressive. I think 20%. Maybe we'll see where it gets to, but that still leaves 75% of the natural gas that isn't going to be addressed. And so buildings are going to, as they get rid of their natural gas, are going to do more efficiency, are going to get there more while the grid gets greener and greener, and we'll sort of kind of meet in the middle. But building owners, I think, are still having a building by building thought about it. And the thing about buildings is you have to think portfolio. You have to think big level. So for example, Lend-Lease, where I am, has a goal of getting the same thing, Scope 1 and Scope 2 carbon neutrality by 2025. And it knows that it has to think on a portfolio level. It's not going to get there in every single individual building. It doesn't work like that. You have to think at scale. The world is a big place, and you have to kind of think about your issues a little more globally. I mean, I think that's a change. I think there's a concern that, if I don't have every single building, as a net zero building on site, then there'll be some sort of flack from the environmental community. And the answer is the environmental community has really embraced real estate getting creative to get there as long as it's meaningful. Stephanie, you're still on mute.
Can you hear me now? Okay, great. Wow, one of those days. So what were some of the things that you found when you talked to other, and today, even in your new role, like when you talk to other real estate portfolio owners, what are some of the things that they are like most worried about? Like the top 1 to 2 things that they're like, gosh, like how did you do that? And then how do you respond to them? What do you tell them about like the solutions that you found to address those challenges?
Absolutely. And one of the things I'm really heartened by is the fact that, and I give all the credit in the world to Kilroy, it's a fantastic organization. At the time that Kilroy made its carbon neutrality commitment, it just hadn't been done, at least among real estate investment trusts in North America. And since then, we've seen company after company make the same declaration. They even had a competitor come in and say they got to carbon neutral in September, and Kilroy got there, December before the deadline, kind of thing. And so I think the largest issues are that real estate companies don't know how to be energy companies, or they're learning. But we're essentially having to, all of us in real estate, are having to figure out how to be grid interactive. The traditional relationship with the grid was you received power. Now all of a sudden you're doing, I'll use a Bloomberg New Energy Finance term, you're now a prosumer. So you're now sending power to the grid. You have a battery that talks about when you're sending power to the grid. You have to deal with energy forecasting. I mean, when you're setting up our power purchase agreement and trying to figure out pricing that was going to make sense for the company, it was something that was outside of our wheelhouse. Real estate companies are very good at buying, selling, operating, and developing real estate. They're not particularly skilled at entering into complicated and expensive, energy deals. And so that's something we're all having to learn very, very quickly. And also we're rapidly shifting our brains from talking about energy to talking about carbon. It was energy, kilowatts for so long. And now we're tons of CO2. It's a much mushier thing to try to figure out. It's much harder to measure, especially when you get into outside of what you directly control, things like construction materials, as you talked about, in addition to things like business travel and transmission losses. These are all harder concepts for real estate. So realizing that real estate has a role to play in the overall carbon story makes it difficult. The other thing is real estate is an incredibly distributed, business. It's not like you can't just decide that you're an automaker, right? But, with a little bit of money, people can, I don't say little bit, obviously, there's a barrier to entry, but, people own real estate, I have I have some extra from whatever, I buy an apartment building, now you're a real estate owner. Okay, so those folks are not a part of any sort of lobbying, any sort of, industry coalitions around energy efficiency. It's an incredibly, diluted, very, very diverse, many owners. And so it's hard to reach many of them. So real estate has a lot of challenges as we're trying to, get everybody on board with the absolutely necessary, but still very ambitious climate goals you were talking about in your slides. Sorry, you're on mute for that.
Yeah, okay, we got some questions popping up in the chat. Hopefully you can hear me. I have just a couple more questions and we're gonna turn it to the audience. So Sarah, on the flip of that question, like when you talk to other, real estate or portfolio owners or people in the buildings industry, what are some of the things that you and your experience actually found easier than people's perception is? Like, what are some of the easy solutions that people might not realize in addressing this?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I learned was that doing an offsite power purchase agreement is so much easier in real estate than doing an on-site power purchase agreement. So just to put this into some perspective, I, blood, sweat, and tears getting 5 megawatts of on-site solar before I left, and Kilroy is now interconnecting some more. You have to get, risk management, insurance, asset management, engineering, everybody, finance, tax, everybody is involved in those deals because it touches so much of a building, and that's 5 megawatts. Our offsite deal, our Kilroy's offsite deal, sorry, this is my first day in the office at Lendlease, so I'm figuring out who's the we, is 84 megawatts of solar. And that only involved finance, tax, and our C-suite. And that was it. It was so much quicker, and as painful and long as it was so much quicker and easier of a deal than the on-site deal. So major opportunity there for real estate companies to start playing in that space, and more people are getting expertise. I think the other thing I've learned is that everything that Kilroy did to get to carbon neutral operations was financially accretive. It's saving money for tenants, it's making the buildings more attractive. And so once we start getting over the hurdle of, how much more does it cost to do sustainability, which drives me crazy. It's like, how much more does it cost to build a building if you want tenants to move in? Like, that's not a question people ask, right? We need to be thinking the same way about energy efficiency. And so, I'm seeing that mindset change. That's difficult, but I think those who have sort of gotten over that initial hurdle really see the reward. So yeah, doing large amounts of offsite procurement currently in this market, while there's still a lot of opportunity, easier than doing the onsite.
Great, thanks. And then just one more question on the sort of tenant. I have a tenants question for you, and then there's some great questions popping up in the chat that I think I'd love to ask you. So how do you deal with the classic split incentive problem? So in the instances where the energy costs may go up, or there's kind of a balance of upfront capital costs that's required to install something, but how do you deal with the tenants paying the energy costs and the portfolio owner paying for some of the upfront capital costs? Do you have any suggestions or recommendations there?
Yeah, green leasing. People get very nervous about talking to their legal teams. But that's really important. So for example, Kilroy had started green leasing in 2014, and like the prerequisites at the heart of any green leasing program, you can require people to do LEED certifications and recycle and, understanding of green cleaning chemicals and all the rest. But really the heart of it is capital recovery. The idea is that, I can do, or I could do, sorry, tenses are funny right now for me, investment in energy efficiency in a building, and then recover that capital from the tenant over a payback period. And that makes it cost neutral. And also that our leases at Kilroy allow Kilroy to broadly have the ability to procure energy. And so a green lease is important. Now, yes, you'll have existing leases. Amendments are really important. Anytime leases are being standardized, making sure that language gets in there is really critical. But beyond that, it's important to talk to tenants. I mean, a lot of them want to do the right thing, and there's also other opportunities now. I mean, we haven't talked about community choice. I mean, there's a lot of really great opportunities to procure 100% renewable at no cost premium for tenants. And I think a lot of folks just assume that it's going to be more expensive when, depending on the rates, depending on the kind of buildings, yes, I've seen it be more, I've also seen it be less. And so, there's a lot of opportunity out there as long as somebody's willing to spend some time doing it.
That's great. Thank you. So I'm going to turn it now to people should feel free to populate more questions in the chat. I'm just going to go through a few of them. You covered a little bit of this, but what are some of the low-hanging fruit that small-scale real estate owners should do first to decarbonize their portfolio?
Right. Technology is changing really, really, really quickly right now, which is really exciting. And so, I love me a good old-fashioned lighting retrofit. The cost of LED lights has come down significantly, especially we're talking bi-level lights in the stairwells. That thing has a payback of like 3 months or something, just because going from the lights on all the time to lights only on when people are going up and down the stairs are fantastic. The other things that are having incredibly quick paybacks right now are things around ventilation. With COVID, we don't have folks in the buildings all the time. So I'm sitting in a conference room. I don't know the last time somebody was using this conference room, but it is a lovely temperature. This building could also, it's not an expensive retrofit to install sort of a smart damper where you're taking down the air when somebody's not in the building. And if you want to be fancy, you can add some, artificial intelligence there to try to learn when people are going to be in and not, but that's getting to next level. So there's great opportunities out right now in terms of pre-cooling technologies that are coming down. No need to have the building spend so much energy on air cooling when you can get the air sort of cooler before it comes in. There's a lot of fun window film out there right now. Kilroy had been using a spray window film that's clear, so it uses nanotechnology without that aesthetic impact. I could go on and on. I love talking about energy efficiency, but there is a lot of low-hanging fruit. My advice to everybody is figuring out what your utilities are incentivizing. Utilities are incentivizing a lot of energy efficiency in different ways in many places across the country, depending on what's most meaningful for them. And figuring out, navigating those incentives are not easy. But when you figure out what's being incentivized, it's often pretty simple to figure out how to do retrofit that's cost effective.
That's great. Thank you. And then there's a question here about how do we address the capital challenge for transforming the built environment?
Right. A lot of people are working on this. The whole finance sector is having to sort of transform itself. So we're seeing really, really great transformation there. So for example, Lend-Lease is working on, has done a lot of green bonds. Kilroy did a lot of green bonds. Right before I left Kilroy, we had just tied our corporate revolver to meeting LEED targets. So there's more incentive towards energy efficiency. There's ESCOs, there's green banks. So I think there's a lot of folks working on the capital issue. One of the things I really like on the multifamily side is, getting, better rates on debt for buildings that have achieved green certification. So a lot of capital is being unlocked. It does take upfront capital. There's really no way to get around that. I love on-bill financing programs from utilities because they're able to sort of solve this problem. But there's got to be a lot of different solutions. I've named some, but I think the thing to remember is that real estate was not set up with energy efficiency in mind. Capital budgets were not designed with energy efficiency in mind. So Kilroy, eventually what we had to do was just set up a standalone sustainability budget, because what was happening is that it was never the emergency, right? So like you have to build out a spec suite, you have to deal with some asphalt that's cracked and is a trip and fall issue, you have to deal with a chiller that's gone down. All those emergencies, those are great, what capital projects are supposed to be. A lighting retrofit is never an emergency. It's never an emergency to put a variable frequency drive on a fan. So really it requires a different way of thinking about monies. And that was the way that Kilroy was able to navigate that. And so that's, there needs to be a lot of different thinking about money, though a lot of people are working on it. But there's a lot of solutions, and I'm sure the crew who's listening in for Dynamo is working on a lot of those as well.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm scrolling through, there's lots of great questions in this chat here. How do you rationalize and prioritize embodied carbon? I believe the question here says embedded, but I believe the intent here was embodied, the sort of concrete, steel, and construction emissions versus operational carbon.
Yeah.
And how do you best communicate and monetize the impact there?
Absolutely. So embodied carbon, or upfront carbon, as some people like to call it, is so fascinating, right? Because we're so early on. But the great thing is right now, I feel like we're at the point, does anyone remember in energy efficiency where we all discovered occupancy sensors and we all just gave each other awards for energy efficiency? Look, I reduced, energy is 10% in my building because I now don't have the lights on all the time. That is where embodied carbon is right now. Where through new tools coming out, such as EC3, the Embodied Carbon in Construction Calculator, which came out at the end of 2019. The organization is Building Transparency, which is the brainchild of a fantastic executive at Skanska called, his name is Stacy Smedley, where we're now able to visualize, the embodied carbon of a lot of very common construction materials, steel and concrete being in there, but also things like gypsum, carpet, and a bunch of other stuff. And so now what's able to happen, so in terms of prioritizing on capital, is that we can go into this tool, we can say, okay, the structural engineer says you need this much concrete at this cure period and this tensile strength, or whatever it is. And you can go in, plug all that in, look at what are called the environmental product declarations, or EPDs, of all of these concretes, and pick the one in that meets your requirements that's at, cost neutral. We can do the first 10 to 15% of embodied carbon reductions in a completely cost neutral way. Now, beyond that, things start getting a little more difficult. Beyond that, then we have to start, it's not a money thing, it's a planning thing right now, where you have to, for example, engage your structural engineer, to change how the structural design is done to maybe use some less carbon. Cross-laminated timber has been great. You're not going to get a materials, it's still more expensive from a material standpoint, but a lot of studies, we show that we save on labor. Lendlease, the company I work at now, like CLT so much that they manufacture it on site in Sydney. And that is a great way to reduce carbon. So for the first 10 to 15%, you don't even have to pay for it. You just have to be smarter about your procurement. And I'm just meeting my team here, but they're doing a really good job of, being there when the buy is happening to make sure that we're doing that analysis and choosing the lower carbon option. And then beyond that, then things are going to get a little different in terms of how our building designs come together.
That's great. I'm so glad you mentioned design. We're also working at embodied carbon at RMI, and that's something we're trying to target, the architecture community, and remembering that some of this is just about like different ways of doing things, and even just awareness, right? And embodied carbon does feel so new to the space that just awareness of different design and different procurement practices is still, we still need to build that knowledge across the industry. Okay, great. So another question for the vendors and the finance companies selling these financing solutions and helping to mobilize capital towards this transition. There's a practical question here about who should they reach within the organization. It's often difficult to find the proper entry point, and maybe you could answer, obviously, if you were at Kilroy, like maybe they would reach you, but what do you do if there's not a sustainability lead, or if there's not a clear department to head?
Boy, I feel you. It is really hard to find the right person. So the right person is often the CFO, but often that person does not know about energy efficiency or why it's important. I think it's important, and I'm sure Mike and everybody else on this call already knows this, but boy, it is critical to speak the language of many different people. There's a different language you use to speak to the chief financial officer versus the head of engineering. Right. And so you're trying to find basically whoever will talk to you. But once you get into that conversation, then the point is to be able to speak how they speak. A head of engineering is not going to, want to talk to you about, cost of capital. The CFO isn't going to know what you're talking about when you say variable frequency drive. And maintenance and all the rest. And so making sure that that there's many hats that you can wear, but I think the point is to get to talk to somebody and then try to figure out who the decision maker is, because often that person is very hidden. It's the engineer who will ultimately be doing the project, but it's very unlikely that there's an engineer who can say yes in a room, and it's figuring out who actually says yes and what language they speak. So I don't envy trying to get to the right people. I think given how much this is changing on the finance side, I think all of the folks on the financial side are really having to learn the importance of sustainability and energy efficiency. I mean, our market is transforming in a way that I've never seen it before. I mean, every company that did not have a head of sustainability has now tried to hire one in the last 18 months. So many folks have called. Who do you know who can do this in this city? Who do you know who can do this in this city? There's not many of us who were just around doing sustainability 10 years ago. And so everybody's having to learn really quickly. The investor pressure and the ratings agency pressure is, and in addition to the tenant pressure, and then if you're in Europe, the regulatory pressure is so strong that everybody's really having to figure themselves out on ESG right now. So you might be surprised that the CFO, who had no idea what you were talking about 18 months ago, has now had to go through a pretty steep learning curve. So I think folks are more receptive right now, but they are not easy conversations.
That's great. Thank you. And then I'm getting the guidance. I forgot. I think I'm supposed to be answering some of the questions too. I was so excited to hear your input here. Yeah, there's a question here. Maybe both of us could answer on how the theme of energy efficiency has shifted over the last several years, and where do you see it coming in the coming years? So maybe I'll start with this. My thoughts on this. So I think the main thing I'll say is that the new energy efficiency is electrification and embodied carbon. That might be an oversimplification, but historically it was about we had a lot of carbon emissions in the electricity sector, and so energy efficiency was the lowest hanging fruit and the top priority for building owners. And now that still is the case. But we're realizing that we need to fully electrify and get rid of the embodied carbon in our buildings as well. And I think the challenge that Sarah has mentioned is that that's not always cost effective immediately in the same way that some energy efficiency measures are, like installing LED light bulbs. I will say that RMI's analysis suggests that like new construction, electrification of new construction is cost effective. You don't have to pay for a gas line. There are a lot of building types where just electrifying the building from the start is the most cost effective solution, which is amazing. But retrofits can be more challenging depending on the climate zone. And so I think that's about figuring out financing solutions. As you mentioned, Sarah, it's about figuring out what policy incentives or programs can we do to get the industry over the hurdle to understanding electrification, and then getting these technologies like heat pumps further and further down the cost curve. Many of them are already very cost effective, but some of them, especially in cold climate zones, they would need enough, they need large enough capacity that they may not be the same, they won't have the same upfront cost as some of the gas furnaces. So we need to work on the right incentive mechanisms to make that shift for portfolio owners. Any thoughts there, Sarah? And then we have a couple more questions.
Come on. Yeah, absolutely. I think you're totally right and spot on. I think I would just say, like, energy efficiency used to be the end all and be all of everything we talked about. And I feel like because we need to talk about embodied carbon and because we need to talk electrification, I feel like, energy efficiency is like, oh yeah, and energy efficiency, in the conversation, like, no, energy efficiency, the megawatt is still like the most cost effective form of, reducing, stuff it's still the most cost-effective clean energy, and so I think just getting it back into the conversation. But yes, I totally agree. The retrofit of the existing building is really hard. I've seen some multifamily not for Lend Lease that's been able to, retrofit maybe like a central boiler, but that's not getting into the individual units. I know one historic building in Santa Monica, a government municipal building that was able to do it. It sort of had to for historic reasons. But yeah, those retrofits are hard. They require panel upgrades. They require, running new lines. It's a really tough thing to retrofit existing buildings to electric, especially given that gas is still pretty cheap in many places in the country.
One thing I'll plug here is we have a really neat, we're collaborating with the DOE, it's called the Advanced Building Construction Collaborative, and we also have a neat program called Realize that's modeled off of Energy Sprong in the Netherlands, which is all about prefabricated units. It's about taking things offsite to do offsite manufacturing. There's this amazing video I should put in the chat about getting, a retrofit in a day of these home units where they're wheeling in the wall panel with the pre-fit window, and the tenants are just inside the building, and you can also have these mechanical pods that are like brought into the building. So our hope is that we can use the example of the Netherlands and try to get retrofits in a way that's more packaged. Right now, I feel like every building is a snowflake, and it can be really challenging to get the costs down. But if we could get retrofits to be seamless, then hopefully we can get those costs down. Okay, one more question and one more call for questions. If anyone has any more, just drop them in the chat. So this is a question for you, Sarah. You successfully helped take Kilroy to carbon neutrality in 2020, and now in your new role at Lend Lease, you have a carbon target of net carbon by 2025 and absolute zero carbon by 2040. So you did answer some of this already, but can you just summarize what are the immediate, midterm, and long-term goals that you have as part of that strategy?
Yes, I'm just getting started on this, so I don't want to overstep my bounds. So yes, so the goal is net carbon neutrality, so that's scope operations, that's scope 1 and scope 2 by 25. And there's some internal requirements about how much of that is allowed to be offsets at various points along the journey, and then absolute zero without offsets. So what Lend Lease calls mission zero by 2040. So, it's a long journey, but like I think, like you said, the fact that we have to get to 50% by 2030 is no small feat. And so it's something that we're working on a lot here. I think we're trying to figure out how to, so measurement is fun, because Lend Lease is a construction company, just measuring construction emissions, not something that Kilroy had to do because we're not our own general contractors. So, what is happening on site? One of the things that I had the pleasure of doing when I got to go to Copenhagen in 2019 for the C40 summit was see clean construction, which is something that is not done in America much. Now we're talking about 1% of an overall building's emissions happen during the construction phase, the diesel that's used to run the crane or whatever. But it's still something that can be addressed. And so that is, something else that is being worked on as well. So there's operational carbon, there's construction carbon, and then there's the embodied carbon, and all of those are going to be addressed in the new policy. So a lot of the, construction side gets really crazy really quickly because you need the ability to charge all of that equipment if it's going to be all electric. So a lot of the cities that have had a lot of success with it, for example, in Scandinavia already have, for example, an all electric, municipal transportation that there's able to do some sharing there. So there's starting needing to be collaboration on the city, state, and federal level pretty quickly. But that's certainly something else that I'm learning what Lend Lease is doing, so I don't want to say what we're doing. But those are the sort of the three aspects that need to be worked on: the operational, the construction, and the embodied.
That's great. Thank you. And I realize this is definitely your first day in the office, so thank you for sharing that, even at a high level. So I did put a last call for questions. I feel like I'm not getting any other questions in the chat. Let's see. Oh, okay. Let's see. One more that I think I missed, and then we can close. This is from Dave. He says, my experience is that payback on ECMs needed to be 18 months. Are you seeing that long-term asset value is now a metric for making big ticket HVAC replacements?
Yeah, 18 months seems real short to me. So at Kilroy, I chafed under a requirement that our paybacks be 3 years or less. It really all comes down to hold time. So if you're going to be, holding an asset for a long time, this is why real estate investment trusts, because they tend to hold their assets for a really long time, do really well with energy efficiency. So yeah, 18 months seems real short to me. Everybody made fun of me for 3 years. I think people are mostly in the 4 to 5 year window. I have seen folks that are willing to do it for longer if they're owner operators, talking like universities, other sort of institutional owners of property. And so, yeah, I think that there is some long-term value, but it really, I highly recommend that you figure out the owner. If you're somebody who's in and out in 24 months, sort of more of a a private equity kind of model, where it's not part of somebody's core fund, it's the value add fund. It's harder to do this big retrofits, and those things really need to happen during the acquisitions due diligence process. And then when you have folks that operate stabilized assets, then you're at a point where you are able to deal with longer paybacks. But still, I would push back on 18 months. Like just in real estate in general, tenants roll every 5 years, right? So the reason that Kilroy set its I can say anything I want about Kilroy now because I'm gone. Is they said the reason it was 3 years is because the idea was tenants roll every 5 years, and so once a tenant moves out, the new tenants move in, and then you can't recover capital from a new tenant if the work had happened before they moved in. And so 3 years sort of made everybody feel comfortable that they were going to get paid back in time. And so that seems pretty reasonable to me. 18 months seems real short unless you're like a Tishman Speyer or something in their non-core fund where they're in and out in 24 months. And then, yeah, you would need 18 just because that's how long they're going to hold their property for.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much for the discussion today, Sarah. So interesting.
Yes, thank you both, Sarah and Stephanie, for an insightful and timely conversation this afternoon. I would also like to thank everyone in the audience for listening in and sending in your questions throughout the conversation. A write-up of this event will be available on our website shortly. And if you would like to be added to our mailing list, let me know as well. We have 2 future events coming up later this month. Our Clean Tech Founders Breakfast Club will be held on June 18th. And our virtual Dynamo Summer Reception will be held on June 23rd. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. Thank you again for attending.